Hey everyone, welcome. I am sitting here with my good friend Darell Epp. I want to tell you a little bit about him if you don't know who he is. Darell Epp's poetry has appeared in over 100 magazines on 6 continents. He has performed readings and conducted writers' workshops across Canada, the US, and the UK. His previous collection, Sinner's Dance, was the recipient of a City of Hamilton Literary Arts Award, and well-deserved. Darell Epp is, I honestly was trying to think the other day how I met you, Darell. I honestly can't remember, but somehow I came across some of your readings on YouTube, and it was just kind of you with probably like your phone, standing on a sidewalk or in a diner somewhere, and reading one of your poems into the camera. And I was like, damn, that is awesome, dude. And I think I even told you when we finally talked, like, you should just keep doing that, because I feel like hearing your poems in your voice, in actually even in that's in your city, you know, like kind of right there in the environment, hearing cars go by and, you know, jackhammers and stuff like that. Like, it was so great. And I really love your poetry. And now every time I read any of your poetry books, I hear your voice, which is really helps a lot, hearing it in your own voice. But thank you. Thanks for joining us. And thanks for an opportunity to talk about your poetry.
Yeah, well, thanks for having me. Like, you know, when I'm writing, I was thought, gee whiz, maybe someday someone will actually read this nonsense. And then to have someone like you as a reader, that's actually kind of what I was aiming for. Like, when it comes to audiences, one is the minimum. More than one is gravy, but if there's one person in Texas who actually gets it, then, oh, wow, I didn't waste my life. High five, you know. So that's great.
Yeah. Well, we were talking a little bit before we hit record. Actually, we should have recorded it because it was kind of gold. We were talking about, this isn't like a telethon or something. And we were saying like, oh, maybe we should do a telethon to save poetry. And this is the problem with it, right? So, and it's so sad, I think, about how poetry, there was a time in history, let's go way, way back, like Lord Byron or something, where poetry was like, this is where it was happening, man. Poetry was everything. And if you were a poet, you were a celebrated, artist, and poetry was seen as valuable and necessary to the human soul. It was, it was understood and accepted as something necessary for sort of the continuation of humanity and the Enlightenment and wisdom and the expression of emotion and things like that. And sadly, I think probably we can talk about this, maybe why we think this happened, but we've now reached this point in history where if something is not easily, commodified, if you can't make money on it, if it's not something, if you can't monetize it, basically, then the value of it seems to have been lost. And poetry seems to have been the victim of that. It's kind of been left in the dirt a little bit, which is a sad thing.
Oh, very much so. Like, first off, when you're talking about Byron, that's actually very true, where in the 1820s, writing poetry could be seen by an ambitious young man as a stepping stone to greater things.
Yeah.
Where Samuel Taylor Coleridge used his skills as a poet as a lever to end up getting a cushy government job and being admired by the general public. And in 2021, poets don't have the same cachet. That's true. But at the same time, it seems like you have to ask yourself in life, what is ephemeral and what isn't, and what do you value? Mm-hmm. And then you kind of plant your flag in the sand and say, this is where I stand, take it or leave it. And I just think Homer and Isaiah have lasted for 4,000 years. And will my clever tweets last for 4,000 years?
Right.
That seems less plausible. So let's just see what happens, right?
Right.
And also, it's very true, and this is kind of what my book talks about, how if we don't pay attention to our surroundings and are very vigilant with our moments, if we don't constantly monitor our attention, that void, that half-assed autopilot, that vacuum will be filled right away by economic factors and economic drivers. So like we say, what do you get paid per hour? Is this worth my time? How much is this worth? It's just something. So in that sense, poetry actually has something in common with prayer. Where basically in our culture, the more you pay me, the harder I'm going to work.
Yes.
And if you pay me the minimum wage, I'm going to put in the minimum effort. But when you're writing a poem or praying, you're focusing your attention as hard as you can on something that won't give you any economic payback. And by doing that, that's actually, in the eyes of most people, that's just stupid.
Yeah.
And it's just a waste of time. But it's also actually an incendiary political act where if you actually say to the bad guys, I'm not going to shop right now. I'm going to focus my attention on this other activity, which doesn't increase the GDP. That's very fishy.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. But here's what's fascinating to me too is even though we are kind of in this place where poetry, just poetry for the sake of poetry is sort of undervalued on one level. At the same time, poetry still has the power and the ability, I think, to surprise us. I mean, I was just thinking as you were talking about, and this isn't a political statement at all. I'm just saying, like, I want to point out something that happened in recent history. During the Biden inauguration, when Amanda Gorman stood up and read her poem, I mean, people were retweeting that poem and talking about her. And all of a sudden she's on the Today Show, and for like a week she was a star. And what did she do? Well, she took time to write a really beautiful poem, and she read it on camera. It's almost like you could almost sense the collective consciousness of Americans going, oh, poetry is beautiful. Wow, words have the power to stir us and bring us together and do. And in other words, like there's a power of poetry that's like we've forgotten it. And once in a while, things can happen that kind of just remind us of that in really surprising ways. And so the potential for poetry to still retain that place in American consciousness or human consciousness is still there. Like poetry hasn't lost any potency or power. Our awareness of it may have, but it's definitely still has the ability to stir people and to make us think in different ways.
Yeah. And this gets back to the thing about always having economics in the driver's seat. I think I lost my train of thought for a minute, so carry on as you will.
Okay. Well, yeah. I mean, so, man, we could talk. You and I could talk.
Oh, yeah, Ed came back. Ed came back.
Okay, go for it.
When this is the case, it leads to people thinking that art is an afterthought. Art is a luxury. Art is a frill. Okay. So once you've sold your soul, doing your best to achieve the American dream and get a fence, then you can put some decoration on your wall and say you're classy, right? But actually, that's really backwards. And certainly, I think art is not a frill or a luxury, but it's something that is actually very, very essential. And obviously my North Star here is always Anton Chekhov, who was the rarest of God's creatures, a great man who was also a good man. Mm-hmm. And he lived under a death sentence his whole life, always like coughing up blood, died when he was 44. But never complained, never whined, and was always superhumanly generous and kind and laughing. And he said the artist's job isn't to provide the right answers, but to provide the right questions.
Yes.
Okay.
Love that.
So basically, if you look out my window here, about 300 meters that way is the Niagara Escarpment. And that's why Niagara Falls exists, because Lake Erie is up there and Lake Ontario is down here. So Hamilton always resisted having huge condo towers until recently. And we had this debate where you couldn't build a condo in the lower city that was higher than being equal with the top of the escarpment. So we're having this debate about these numbers, right? And it's funny, like the words epistemological and ontological, they're not, they're too difficult to say to ever become memes.
Right.
But they ask the question, but basically, if you don't think about those two words that aren't fun to say, you're left with just zeros and ones.
Yeah.
So right now we're debating, the number of feet you can go, but no one ever says, what is a neighborhood for? And is a community supposed to serve humans, or is it supposed to serve these zeros and ones?
Yep.
Of the accountants?
Yes.
So hopefully good art can sort of just kind of gently poke and prod you to remind you of these yearnings that are universal but have been buried.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. And I want to quickly, if we can, transition a little bit into specifically your art and your poetry, because again, I'm a huge fan. I'm going to do something real quick here. I'm going to just show people some of your poetry books, and I'd like you to read, if you would, a poem from from your most recent collection. But Imaginary Maps by Darell Epp. Is this your first one?
It is.
Yeah, that one's really good. And then I think this is the right order. Is it After Hours is next?
You're doing good so far, yeah.
Okay, all right.
Yeah,
I think I'm going to make it now. After Hours.
Yep.
Which, by the way, has an endorsement from William Peter Blatty, author of The Exorcist, who says, I enjoy these poems immensely. So there you go. I mean, come on. And then Sinner's Dance, which I really love a lot. I think this is about the time I ran into you, was this collection. And love it, really love it. And then your most recent one is Mechanical Monkeys, which, by the way, you have to zoom in here because it's got Robbie the Robot, which is why I used Robbie the Robot for our event image. Because you and I, by the way, also have we would have been good friends growing up if we lived in the same town. We would have had great fun. We had the same toys. We liked the same TV shows. I think you and I are definitely the same kind of. Even though it's weird, right? Because I grew up in like Texas and you grew up in Canada, right?
Yeah.
But somehow it worked out. But I really like your stuff, and what I love about your poetry, I wanted to say, is that I love how grounded your poetry is in the world we live in. I mean, because you talk about pop culture, you talk about things going on in current events, but not in a way that sort of dates it. It's not something where 10 years from now, someone's going to read one of your poems and go, what's that? So it's not like pop culture stuff, but it's more like just the culture that we live in, the world that we live in. And I just, it's hard to describe. I think I've told you before, you remind me a little bit of it's almost a mix of Carl Sandburg and one of my favorite poets who wrote Degrees of Grey in Phillipsburg. I just lost his name. See, we're both getting old, man.
Yeah.
But anyway, that sort of, I don't know how to describe it. Well, I guess let people hear you sort of reading one of your poems, and I think it'll explain what I'm talking about.
Okay, actually, I thought I would do something a bit different. This is a poem that I have some affection for, so I'm just going to read this. Oh, and by the way, this was William Peter Blatty's favorite poem of mine.
Okay, great. Now, so what is this from? This is from what? Some After Hours. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, great.
So this was the, yeah. Anyhow, this is a poem called Weather Report. Unnoticed, grace rolls in from the northwest, raining down on rub-and tugs and cemeteries, the tenements with the asbestos and the live wires. That rich duke's house they turned into a museum. Shawarma huts and money marts, raining down on the just and unjust, with no questions asked. Anil Verma scratches to win like his life depends on it. Over his shoulder, his shadow is laughing at him. Moisha gets tagged by the new red light cameras. Adrian thinks of going back to school for something practical. And when things get tight, everybody stares into a glowing screen. We have at least that much in common. Dean's on his knees again, hoping Jesus grades on a curve. 0% financing, half off, 1 day only. It's raining harder now, down the graffiti-stained plywood where the windows used to be. And something about how the walls meet the roof makes me weepy, jittery. Something is up tonight. We tighten our grip on our remote controls. Grace comes to town and we don't even hit pause as it rains all the way to the Erie Canal and down on a drafty row house sublet to a sensitive soul riding a crest of bad luck. Next to his toilets, a milling-selling how-to book called Your Best Life Now. The author's incisors twinkle like stars. So there's one.
Oh, I love it. I really do. And there's just like even that poem right there is a great one, I think, to start with, because it's a wonderful example of what I was talking about, how you're mixing in things that we're all familiar with, but they show up almost like little characters in your story here, like if the poem was sort of like a short story. And I pick up on something in that poem, and I think definitely in your newest one, Mechanical Monkeys. It seems that, correct me if I'm wrong, I mean, if I'm picking up on something that's there or not, but it feels like sometimes technology shows up in your poetry as sort of like a either a necessary evil or maybe sometimes something that is distracting us from the world around us in ways that we're not able to perceive as completely as we could or should.
Well, it's kind of a funny question to answer in the sense that when you're an artist, you want to figure out a way to have your own voice and say something in a fresh way. Artistic maturity is kind of like a flower that blooms when it wants to, where in the case of Arthur Rimbaud, it opened when he was 15 and closed when he was 19. And with Grandma Moses, it opened when she was 80 or whatever. And that's just how it is, right? So for me, it took a long time to kind of figure this out, where I always thought, oh, I want to be a writer. And I thought, how when you have surgery, your anesthesiologist isn't 19, he isn't 20 or 39. You want an anesthesiologist who's had a long apprenticeship,
right?
Who has a lot of experience. So I thought, if you're arrogant enough to think a stranger should spend time thinking about your thoughts or they're that special, you'd have a long apprenticeship. So I spent, I basically loitered in the public library since about 1991, researching Western literature and learning about story, how all this works. But then the big breakthrough came, and I actually started getting good when I started to write things that I didn't know how to write. Where I used to work in the theater, and I'd write stuff like, oh, this sounds like a guy who likes Pinter and Shepard and The Usual Suspects. And then when I wrote prose that was pretty accomplished, people liked it. But for me, I'd read it and think, this sounds a lot like Sam Shepard, and there already is a Sam Shepard.
Right.
The world doesn't need two of them, right? And then when I went to poetry, I was able to talk about the things that I wanted to talk about in kind of a fresh way, and that's when I found my voice and things clicked, right?
Yeah.
Like when I was a kid, I read science fiction, so I assumed I'll grow up and write science fiction novels. And it turned out most of the things about the novels actually really bored me. And what I liked about them was when you would dream about them or half remember the images, but the actual thing about he said, she said, nothing happens till page 80.
Right.
Right. And it's like the great thing about poetry was it forces you to be precise.
Yes.
Because if it's not, it just smells wrong and anyone can tell, right?
Mm-hmm.
And any novel that people say, oh, here's the hot novel of the year, check it out. You read it and you're like, good Lord, where was the editor? This should have been cut by a third.
Exactly.
And so then when I started writing, people would comment about, oh, there's a lot of pop culture stuff in your work. And I kind of thought to myself, what planet do you live on? Like, try going for 5 minutes without seeing an advertisement.
Right.
Like, I like Henry James novels where he can spend 5 pages describing how a lady folds her napkin or how a lady tells a lie. But the fact is, you know, the world isn't like that at the moment, and things have changed.
Yeah.
And how much of your day today would strike someone from 1980 as science fiction?
Oh my gosh. Yeah, I mean, look, just the fact that I have one of these in my pocket, and if you'd have told me when I was a little kid that I'm going to have this little device that looks like a slab of glass, and I'm going to be able to touch it and make videos, take pictures, talk to people in Japan, you know, play games, like all, I mean, I would be like, no, I'm not. Like that's impossible, right? Yeah, and it's really actually, it was ironic too, even as I was asking you that question about technology and all this stuff, I realized we're sitting on Zoom, streaming live into Facebook, and discussing whether or not technology is an intrusion into our lives.
Yeah. It's like I'm gonna sit here and tell you at the speed of light, technology sucks. Buy my book, subscribe to my newsletter.
Yeah, get my books on Amazon. I'm on Twitter and Facebook.
Yeah.
Yeah, watch this video later on YouTube. Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
So, you know what's funny about how Jonathan Swift, who wrote like Gulliver's Travels, he once said, it's hard not to write satire. And it's kind of a joke because he was a satirist where he would write, and guess what? He would point out the foibles of the common man and show how absurd our behavior is. And like, then he starts doing it, it's like, oh wow, welcome to life. I can't turn it off. Yeah. Because the like human race is a mess, right? And then in 1980, J.G. Ballard said, it is hard not to write science fiction. Right? Because the story of our time, you might think you're writing a boy meets girl story, but always lurking in the background is how technology has changed, warped, damaged, destroyed, whatever our inner life, our relationships, our actual neighborhoods, our physical neighborhoods. Think about how Amazon has destroyed downtown because they don't have to pay property tax locally. So I just thought, if you want to write something that is honest and documents a moment and also has a chance of surviving, you probably couldn't do that by pretending you're still in a Henry James novel.
Right.
And this is just the reality, right? Also, I just thought it was interesting about how it's as you've noticed how it's as easy for you to think about a fictional character as it is to think about a real person. It's as easy for you to think about the past as the future. And that's kind of neat. And it just seemed to me that poetry is a good way to simulate a moment of consciousness about what it's actually like to be alive. Like the way you'll have a song stuck in your head that you don't even like. I'm like, oh, wow, right? And, again, I'm hoping people will read the books and become just pay more attention to their surroundings. Otherwise, that mental landscape will be squatted on by Disney.
Yeah.
Yeah, very much so.
Yeah. No, I like that, man. I wrote down some notes here because as you were talking, so many things popped into my head. I think your Ballard quote reminded me of what was really fascinating to me, like William Gibson. So he wrote a science fiction book that won many awards. It's called Neuromancer, and it was the first book that ever really sort of codified cyberpunk, the cyberpunk movement, which really, without Neuromancer, we would never have had the Matrix or anything like that. And it's a great book, but what's really fascinating is, that was a great science fiction book. He actually turned that into a trilogy, but every book he wrote after that was essentially the same kind of a book. I mean, it was still a book about the same kinds of things happening with technology and things like that, except that they were set in modern day. And so it was kind of funny, like he kind of wrote a science fiction book that was right at the cusp of this technological, the internet was going to break through and everything. And then as he kept writing, he didn't have to change his style. It's just that his science fiction all of a sudden was about the world we live in today. And I really appreciated that about the fact he didn't try to like, oh, okay, things have changed. Let me write about something 40 more years into the future. He just kept writing the same kind of books. And what he's pointing out is the fact that we now live in that future. And that's always been really fascinating to me. And then your other point, real quick too, the other point you made too about when you were trying to write fiction and all that, like I did the same thing when I was in college. I was a creative writing major in college, and I actually won an award. I won a fiction award for my college, and it was actually one of my assignments for the class. We were reading, like Mickey Spillane and Raymond Chandler, kind of the hardball detective stuff. And so I wrote this. It was called St. Pete, Florida Blues, and I wrote this kind of detective Trent Ballou, and he's looking for this rich guy, hires him to find his daughter who's missing, and it was a hardball detective thing. And all I'm doing really is my impression of Mickey Spillane and Raymond Chandler. And I did it really well. I did it well enough that I won an award for it. But I made a decision after I won the award for it that I would never publish that thing, because it was because it just felt like it's not me. It's me doing my impression of somebody else. Like you said, there already is a Mickey Spillane. There already is a, Henry James or whatever. Like, does the world need another one? I mean, and some people, yeah, maybe they do. It's fun to keep reading. They've continued to do the James Bond novels. Like there's all these other people, James Gardner. It's not Ian Fleming, though. It's maybe their best impression of Ian Fleming. But yeah, I'm more interested in creating something new, and even discovering as a writer what is my voice. What is it that makes, what can I say in my own voice rather than sort of mimicking somebody else's voice?
Yeah, I mean, humans are about imitation, and you learn to walk before you run and all that. So that's all part of the process. And certainly in the past, I wrote a bunch of stuff and people would comment that it was prolific. But now when I look back, if the general public just knows these 4 books, I'd be more happy with that, because I know they're all home runs and they're not really that like derivative, like you were saying, right?
Yeah.
I remember in the 1990s when I thought, oh, I'm going to be a science fiction writer. And I would literally have this experience. I would write a science fiction story of something, and before I could get the story published, it would come true.
Yes.
Where it would actually happen. So I'm like, God damn, the news beat me again, right? And so one thing I would do in the 90s is I would read the weekly world news for story ideas. And they had a story in there about the National Organ Lottery. where they said in the future, the healthcare system is going to be so bad, if you need a kidney, you'll enter a lottery for it. And then I wrote a play about that was kind of fun. And I just thought, okay, well, even if this comes true, I liked how I was able to use this trope because I had a mad scientist in it to talk about things that are universal, like things like selfishness, venality, and things that don't change.
Mm-hmm.
Like, it's funny, I'm a big fan of the Greek theater, like Sophocles and Aeschylus, and people find them difficult, but what are they about? They're about fathers and sons, and something horrible happens. There's revenge, and the revenge turns out to be more brutal than the original offense. And it's like it's as up to date as anything you can imagine, because human nature hasn't changed. So you always have these specifics, but you can use them judiciously to point to things that don't change.
Yeah.
Like, again, when you read Chekhov, you might not be a cobbler in Siberia, but you're on the edge of your seat, because it's actually not about the story. It's about being a human being, feeling yourself going forward on the river of time, having regrets, having yearnings, all these things, right?
Yeah. Yeah. And, I think it's funny too, because like you and I have that in common. Like when I was young, I used to go to the bookstores. Like when my parents would go to the mall, I would go straight to the bookstore and I would go to the science fiction section. And I would imagine that one day my science fiction books, because I was going to be, in my mind, I was going to be a science fiction author, and they were going to fit right between Alan Dean Foster and Robert Heinlein, right there. Keith Giles,
Yeah.
they were going to go right in there. And I tried writing science fiction, and I did. I read a lot of science fiction. I did some comics for a while with some people based on my science fiction ideas. But so here's the thing though, I think, and see what you think about this, because the thing about science fiction, I think often we assume science fiction is about having that really cool idea about the future, some awesome technology or some amazing thing like that. You got to have that. And I don't think you necessarily do. I mean, like, I love Philip K. Dick. I'm a huge Philip K. Dick fan. And quite often, I mean, and not that he doesn't have phenomenal ideas. I mean, yes, he has amazing ideas, but usually even that may be what hooks you, right? You might read the back of the book and go, oh, there's a guy who lives in this universe where time moves backwards. Well, that sounds wild. And so you read it, but then when you discover is that thing that's happening, that little weirdness that makes that book kind of places it in that science fiction world. The book is about the character. The book is about the guy like trying to get back with his ex-wife and, trying to earn enough money so he can buy, an electric sheep or whatever, or whatever it happens to be. And it's like, and that to me is what makes it, that's what makes it either a good story or a bad story. Like, in other words, you as a writer have to write stories that are human, that are relatable. And then if anything, it may be more challenging to do that in a universe where time moves backwards or whatever, right? Because again, your challenge is to make it human and relatable. What do you think about that? Do you agree with that or no?
Well, yeah, I mean, first off, should I talk about the history of science fiction, or here's my hot take. If when it comes to fiction that's human and relatable, I'd have to mention The Jewels of the Cabots by John Cheever, which is basically one of the high points in American literature, where if you read the collected short stories of John Cheever, it's a real testament to hard work, because they just get better and better. Where what happens is he starts off writing short stories that are perfect in terms of structure and all. It's just perfect. And then he's like, okay, I'm perfect. What do I do now? He starts writing stories without plots that are just character sketches, stories where the story is narrated by a dog, anything he can think of. And The Jewels of the Cabots is one of his last stories, where it literally starts off with the narrator saying, I'm going to tell you about the murder. So you have this expectation set up. And then for 15 pages, the narrator tells you about the history of race in America, the history of class, life, death, his high school sweetheart, his first thing. All these things that are plotless and just absolutely gripping, because it has this inevitability to it, like a drunk in a bar pouring his soul out to you, or like the Rime of the Ancient Mariner, where like, I have to tell you this, and if I don't, I'll just die. And then at the end of the story, he says, oh yeah, by the way, she poisoned him with rat poison from the pet food store. At the end.
At the
right?
end.
Yeah, and you read it, and you're like, my God, this is actually a story about not telling the story.
Yeah.
It's a story about circumlocution, about not saying what has to be said because it hurts.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Right? So, and it's funny, if I say this, it sounds corny, but when he says it through art, it's not corny. If I say,
right.
All those things in your life you should have said but never got around to it, right? It sounds corny because it's cliched from overuse, because it's true,
Mm-hmm.
right? Like, we do have regrets and things we wish we'd said. So he actually has these stories about fathers and sons who didn't have that conversation they should have had, and all these things.
Right.
And it's really thrilling and really perfect. So that's something that is really haunting and human. So that's a real hot, something I have to mention when it comes to stories like that. And the history of science fiction is really interesting, because now that we can do an autopsy on 20th century science fiction, it's kind of interesting to see how much they got wrong.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
See, that's my point. I think that's my point. I don't think science fiction is about predicting the future. I think it's more about, for me, I don't mean to interrupt you, but I would just let me add this little extra thing. Like, to me, great science fiction isn't about the future. It's about now. And it's sort of, but it takes what's happening, what it wants to say about what's happening now, and puts it in a sort of like, over there. Let's talk about these other people over there, and look what they're doing. It's really crazy, like Gattaca is a great example to me. Like, can you imagine a society where people would like sort of like go in and choose their babies ahead of time? And what would that be like? And it's more of like a cautionary tale for us, because we're pretty close to making the same kind of decisions today, right? If a science fiction isn't about today, if it doesn't reflect back to like something we're dealing with and struggling with or considering right now, at least to me, I don't see the value in it. It's not just about laser beams and cool technology and, you know what I mean, whiz bang kind of futuristic stuff.
Well, first off, most of the science fiction is junk, like trash.
Let's just say
and yeah, and the good things you can glean out of it are there by accident and have more to do with you kind of digging extra hard than anything that was there intentionally. And the emergence of science fiction has a lot to do with where America was at a certain place. And basically, in the late 1800s in America, they had dime novels that sold millions about the taming of the West.
Right.
And then shortly after the turn of the century, very quickly, you had Buck Rogers and Tom Swift and these stories about the future. And basically, in a country that is old, like England, they had stories that bound the community together about the distant past, like The Lady in the Lake and The Sword and the Stone.
Mm-hmm.
And America was a young country with no past, so they had mythical stories that could encourage and bind people together about the future.
Right.
And actually, TASER is an acronym for Tom A. Swift's automatic rifle.
Interesting.
Yeah. So there is like life imitating art,
right.
where Tom Swift was created to inspire young Americans to behave in a certain way, and now cops are tasing people for real.
Right.
And
Progress.
basically, progress. And basically, in the golden age of science fiction, the implicit message was that the future is going to be great and it's going to be American. And we're going to go to Mars and we're going to do to the Martians what we did to the Seminoles.
Yes.
And we're going to do to the Martians what Canada did to the Beothuks and the Micmacs.
Yeah.
And it's going to be great.
Oh, yeah.
It's going to be awesome. So, you know, it's like, imagine if you were an American back then and the first flight was like in 1903, and then in 1969, they go to the moon. So, of course, you'd be watching this thinking, that's pretty much for one lifetime. I bet by 2021, we'll all be living on other planets and galaxies.
And
like if you look at that trend, of course,
cars. Yeah, exactly.
Right. So that whole thing was based on a certain type of American confidence and exceptionalism about when we go to Mars, it's going to be like what we did to the Old West. It's going to be awesome. It's going to be great. And again, on the other hand, J.G. Ballard's earliest memories involved seeing corpses stacked up like firewood in a internment camp.
Right.
And you know, when he was like 4, 5, 6, corpses were all around him. So he built up this body of work that doesn't have the same gung-ho confidence and militaristic triumph or expansionist ideas of Heinlein or whoever.
Right.
And it's very much about disassociation and the death of affect and PTSD. So his science fiction still seems very up to the moment, where he was all about what if technology, instead of giving us the Star Trek thing of like, it's like now, but way more awesome.
Right.
You know, right? Yeah, so it's fun to look at like science fiction, like, oh wow, Blade Runner happened in 2019. Where's my flying car? Right. Meanwhile, in J.G. Ballard's science fiction, he imagined a world in which technology estranged us from our neighbors.
Imagine that.
Can you imagine? Right. So it's funny in 1980, you know, and like all these people in the 20th century, they call them futurists, and they made money from predicting things in the future and being wrong.
Right.
And in 1985, J.G. Ballard said, "I guarantee you one thing, 100%: the future is going to be boring." Okay. Now, what on earth did he mean by that? Well, in the 80s, he wrote a short story called The Secret History of World War III. And in this story, World War III actually happened, but the population was too glued to their screens to look up and notice.
Right.
Okay. Right. You know, it's like, you know, in 1860, when Joseph Conrad wanted to change his life and he was 16, he adopted a secret identity, changed his name, learned a new language, and traveled to the other side of the planet, dealing with pirates, smuggling gold, battling death, disease, and all this stuff. And now in 2021, a young man seeking adventure goes into his mother's basement in the dark and chooses a simulation of adventure, plays World of Warcraft or Tom Clancy.
Fallout 4 or whatever.
Yeah. So again, we now live in a world due to technology where the simulation is more persuasive and more seductive than the real thing.
Right. And it's also, in a way, it sort of creates our imaginations and our creativity start to atrophy. It's almost like a muscle no one ever uses. So like rather than, in other words, I think in some ways boredom is a wonderful thing for young people, because when you're bored, I mean, when I was bored, I would sit down and write a story, or you create something, you'd write a poem, your brain would engage because it was bored, and you would use some creativity to sort of entertain yourself. Whereas now it's too easy. You don't have to ever engage that muscle. The options are endless with the internet and YouTube and video games, and I mean, it's endless.
Oh, and I think it's a serious problem. And like, what if it's the biggest problem? Like, people make money from getting you terrified about things on a daily basis, and then,
Yeah.
Like I was told in the 80s, acid rain was going to kill me. Then it was Al Qaeda. Why hasn't Al Qaeda killed me yet? Right. And it always goes on.
Right.
But like, this is actually a serious problem. Like, Jesus said, number one job is love your neighbor. But the problem is loving your neighbor isn't any fun.
Right.
And
I'd have to get to know my neighbor.
Right. And that involves a risk.
Mm-hmm.
So it's easy to, avoid the risk by just staying inside. Also, my neighbor has these things in his ears.
Right. I can't talk to him.
Where he doesn't want me to say hi to him because he has this thing going on. Right. So how can I love my neighbor if my neighbor never goes outside and leaves the basement because the clarity on his TV is unparalleled?
Right.
Right. So that's a big problem.
Yeah, absolutely. Hey, I love this conversation, but we were actually supposed to talk about your poetry too. So would you mind reading another one of your poems? Do you have one in mind that you would like to read?
Yeah, sure. This is, yeah.
And by the way, we are getting some comments and questions, but after you read this, we'll go to some of those.
Okay, yeah. You're supposed to be selling some books here, not just.
Oh yeah, by the way, come on, Darrell.
Solving all the world's problems, yeah. Okay, so this is called New Rules. I always solved jigsaw puzzles with a really big hammer. Now they tell me that's cheating. Took me years to realize the commute cost more than the job paid. Beasley Parks dream of the green like a holy anchor amidst unjust bylaws. A dispossessed warbler's short-circuited shriek when weather's the only sermon we need. Words like old classmates after the plastic surgery. Words traveling on phony passports, and the one word that's missing. The gift of language was like giving the car keys to the prodigal son. Rates of exchange between light and time, objects defining their shadows, the scar in the bark of the oak I'd love to climb. Peeled back the topsoil, put my ear against the thick river of quartz frozen in sandstone, waited for something more profound than a busy signal. That summer sublet above the shooting gallery was bursting with magic, trapdoors everywhere. So many rabbits in so many black top hats, and card tricks packed so tight I could barely move. The Joker would pop up in the oddest places, the toaster, the fish tank. When I was 7, I was late for meatloaf because the neighborhood bully stole my bike. I've been paying for it ever since.
Wow. I love it. So good. Yeah. How do your poems sort of all come to you at once, or are you constantly kind of writing ideas down? I'm just curious because I'll be honest, like when you're reading that, it feels like I could ask you right now and you could just open your mouth and you could just create one right now, just like that. Is it that easy for you, or is it more of a struggle to work out some of the lines?
Well, I'm no spring chicken, and I gotta say it was a lot easier back in the old days. I remember when I was 20, I would just be walking down the street and some line would just pop in my head. And as you get older, it gets kind of tougher. Normally what happens is I'll try to pay attention and make little notes of things that kind of strike me throughout the course of my day. Like a few days ago, I saw a bird that was trying to fly and it couldn't fly. And I almost ran over it with my bike. And to avoid hitting it, I almost had to sort of crash this bike. So I thought, oh, I'll just make a note of that. That's worth recording at some point. So, and then I'll have like one day a week where I actually kind of sit down and I'm in a certain mindset where I can actually start motoring and start off with something that it really strikes me. And hopefully, once you get started, rhythm and meter kick in and help you just keep things going.
Yeah.
And, I remember one time they asked Nick Cave what was the hardest part of writing a song. And he said, getting started.
Right.
And that's totally true, because once you get started, hopefully things just kind of have a life of their own. But yeah, there are times where I'll start a poem and I'll think to myself, wow, I really like what I have, but I don't know where it's going. And then I'll have to let it sit for a while, or I'll actually go through a notebook and I'll have old notes saying like, and I'll have 4 lines saying, this is good for an ending. If in an emergency, try this, and I'll try to piece it together and see what happens.
Yeah.
And for me, like it's funny, like if I had an idea for a thriller and you find out who done it on the end, and I sort of, for me, there wouldn't be a point in like if I had a story all worked out in my head, I'd be thinking, why bother writing it?
Right.
Why not just think about it? Because for me, it's all about the surprise. And I was always a big believer in, if I'm surprised, there's a better chance the reader is going to be surprised. So, yeah. Yeah, for me, like since these books don't, like the financial compensation isn't huge, like Harry Potter levels. So for me, the main compensation is the surprise of going like, oh, wow, I didn't know I could do that. And it turns out I did. Or just thinking, here's a good opening. What on earth can I do with it? And then figuring something out. And then once you have a set of like 300 of them, you can look back and say, oh, wow, it turns out there is a few common threads that do tie it all together.
Right.
So it seems like these books do have like a narrative line tying it all together, or certain concerns that repeat, that are dealt with, in an oblique but kind of fresh way. Like if I just said, technology's bad, this is bad, gentrification's bad, polluting is bad, people shouldn't pollute, right? Then people would say, oh my God, this sounds like a sermon. And no one likes hearing sermons.
Right.
But if you just touch on that obliquely while giving them bang for their buck with rhythm and meter, then it makes it easier to swallow. And it also has a chance to sort of linger and haunt.
Oh, yes.
As opposed to just being propaganda or a sermon where it's just one thing.
Yeah. Yeah. I totally agree, man. I think when you were talking about not knowing the ending, it reminded me, there's a quote I saved it because I'm going to end up using it in a project I'm working on coming up. But there's a really great quote, Stephen King. I was watching Stephen King. It was an interview he was doing. And someone asked him about his writing. And they said, do you, like a lot of writers say, before you write the first line, you should know how it ends. And he said something like, that's the worst thing I could possibly do. Like for me, if I know the ending, like it's almost like what you said, if I know the ending before I start writing, why bother writing it? Like, because I want to write it. I have an idea, I have a universe, I have a character, I have a concept. I start writing it. He goes, but I'm writing it because I don't know how it's going to end. I want to know. And he goes, sometimes as I'm writing it, I think I know where it's going, but when I get there, the characters will surprise me. Like they'll do something I didn't expect. Like they almost have a life of their own. Like they want to do something that I wasn't thinking like it was going to happen that way. And that's an odd way. If you're not a writer, I think you can hear that and go, that sounds bizarre. But if you are a writer, you can say, oh no, I totally get that. Because I've done that. I've actually sat down to write something that I did assume I knew where it was going. And then as I write it, I suddenly trip on something and go, oh my gosh, this is way better.
Well, it's also horrible advice, and it's a real misapprehension that non-writers have about how art is made.
Right.
Like if you sit there and think, oh, I guess I can't write anything today because I don't have a good idea. If that was the case, I'd never write anything.
That's
It doesn't
right.
make any sense, right? It's
Right.
nonsense. And like I remember Sam Shepard. One time they said, "Oh wow, you're a very prolific playwright. Where do you get your ideas?" And then Sam Shepard said, "That's not how it works." He said, "I write plays because I'm in the habit of writing plays, and once in a while, I can look over my shoulder and say, oh wow, there was an idea there."
Right.
Right? And it's like ideas are a dime a dozen, right? It's so crazy. It's like I could say, do a story about a bank robbery where it falls apart. One guy's a robot, there's a double cross. So what, right? It's all about the hard work and how it's done, right?
Right.
And it's like I remember when Sam Peckinpah was making The Wild Bunch, the whole the structure of the screenplay is built so that the big moment is when they blow up a bridge. And then they said to Peckinpah, you can't blow up a bridge in the middle of The Wild Bunch because Sergio Leone just blew up a bridge last year in The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly.
Right.
And your movie stars William Holden, and he blew up a bridge in The Bridge on the River Kwai.
There you go.
So you can't do it. And then Sam Peckinpah says, none of that matters. What matters is how you blow up a bridge.
That's right.
And it's so true. And yeah, I always remember the great novelist Umberto Eco. He said, "A great book is always smarter than its author."
Oh, I like that.
And I think that's really crucial because a lot of people think, "Oh well, my mom told me I'm special. She said I was smart. I'm going to write and show the world how I'm special." And you've read books like that where the guy had some great idea that he had to shoehorn in there, right? And that's not your job. Your job is just to do the hard work, and all those other things kind of take care of themselves.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that is exactly right, man. Yeah, I want to read. I would love to keep going on this, but I want to at least pay attention to some of the comments people are making here. So a lot of people saying, someone wanted to ask. Tim Reed asked, who did the cover art? And I think the last 3 of your books, is it the same artist?
Yeah, my books are done by Gord Puller, Pullar, and he lives 3 doors down that way.
No way.
Yeah.
Very cool.
So I met him because there was a publisher in Hamilton who was doing a comic book anthology in about 2001, and I wrote a couple of page, like 1 or 2 one-page comic strips that Gord illustrated, and he's done sculpture, painting, woodworking, and lately he's been doing a lot of he rehabilitates stained glass windows in old churches.
Oh, cool.
Yeah, and I'm hoping to have a book that comes out next year or early 2023, and he's also doing the cover for that as well. So it's by my neighbor right there, Gord.
That's so cool, man. That's awesome.
Yeah.
Okay, so Becky Waldenberg has a question, and this is more for you because I'll just tell you right now, the answer for me is no. She's asked, have either of you read The Grand Biocentric Design, How Life Creates Reality by Robert Lanza, Matej Pavsik, etc.? As I understand it, it's an explanation of how our thoughts create the universe as we know it from a quantum physics perspective.
Right. I've actually heard about it, and I'm kind of a big fan in the sense that, philosophical movements come and go like fashion, and oftentimes they're of a moment and of a reaction to something. So do you know how there was the big new atheist movement of Richard Dawkins and all this stuff?
Yeah.
And they made their millions, and they're richer than I'll ever be. So good for them. But that was actually a really reactionary movement against people like Ken Hamm, who built Noah's Ark in Kentucky.
Right.
And actually, I talk about
Scientist.
Ken Ham in my book about the Noah's Ark thing.
Oh, yeah. You know what? Yes, I did. I read that. That's in your newest one, isn't it?
Yeah. And it's funny. I just thought it was wrong. Like if you were a real Christian who was born again, would you be selling tickets to Noah's Ark? Like if you were a Christian, wouldn't you want people to go on board for free, right?
Right.
That kind of bugged me. And actually, Lou Reed once had a song where he said, they're lining up for Noah's Ark. They're stabbing each other in the dark, saluting a flag made of some rich guy's socks.
I love it.
But anyhow, now in 2021, the only people who still care about the Earth being 6,000 years old are people whose income depends on it.
Right. Ooh.
Right.
Yeah.
Like people like Ken Ham or like teachers at a very few number of schools. But for most people, it's like, I have other things to worry about. Who cares? I'm trying to pay the bills, right?
Yeah.
So the New Atheist movement was picking up this low-hanging fruit.
Yes.
Right. Where they write a book saying there's no God. So then I'm thinking, oh wow, St. Thomas Aquinas wrote 4 million words saying there is. This book must go through Aquinas's 4 million words and debunk that. And then you look at Christopher Hitchens' book, and he doesn't even mention Aquinas.
No.
He just says like Ken Ham's an idiot. It's like, well, yeah, he is. So what?
Yeah, I knew that. Tell me something I don't know.
Right. So it's funny how lame and reactionary that thing was. And like I said, they got rich, which is what they wanted.
Right.
But then time goes on. The sad thing is, it actually convinced people that the materialist worldview had something to it. And the sad thing about that is it's hard not to end up being very reductionist with that, where you're like, well, if I'm just a bag of cells, blind processes, how can my choices be meaningful, right? And actually, atheist materialism has a lot in common with Calvinism, where both put you into a deterministic world, which ends up bleaching the meaning out of every human activity. And that's not fun. So the thing about the book mentioned in this question is it shows, first off, why do I have to pretend I've got it all figured out just to make you subscribe to my newsletter?
Right.
What if reality is very complex? And now there is all sorts of research being done about how this idea about there's a physical world and then we're just here thinking about it, right? It's like the relationship between mind and matter is actually a lot more fun and interesting.
Oh yeah.
Than like you ever thought. And it's no mystery to think that my book contains markings that you then translate into meaning, right?
Mm-hmm.
But now we're finding out that what if the universe is like a hologram being projected on a flat screen? What if information isn't just going on in this little tiny pocket of reality, but it actually is like a fundamental building block? So I'm happy that books like that exist so that people can have a more fun experience. Like basically, it's like it's like you say, oh wow, there's a God, that's like ridiculous. It's like, well, yeah, it is, but the alternative is also ridiculous. Basically, either mind created matter or matter created mind, and either way, it's pretty shocking.
Yes.
Okay,
that whole quantum thing is pretty amazing, actually. I agree. I've read some books on it. I'm still reading some books on quantum, and it's fascinating. The convergence of science and mysticism and philosophy is very exciting. Really love that. Hey,
right.
We've been talking for about an hour, but can I ask you to read? I'm going to have a request. Would you read the poem Postcard from Babylon? Because that's the one where you mentioned the Noah's Ark.
Which book is that in?
That's in Mechanical Monkeys.
Okay, it's a good thing
Page
it's a
21.
good thing you're here.
Page 21. No, I do the same
Oh,
thing, by the
actually,
way. People interview me and they start quoting one of my books, and I'm like, wait, what page is that?
yeah. Are there any more questions? That'd be cool if it
Actually,
was.
I do
But
have a question. Brett Strobich asks you, does music inspire you in the writing process, either as an earlier part of the process to inspire you, or do you listen to any music while you write?
There were certain musicians that kind of certainly inspired me early on. Um, in a lot of ways, like this gets back to the question of influence, and you're grateful you have influences, but at some point you have to free yourself from them.
Right.
And basically, it's like you know, when Lou Reed went to Syracuse University, his goal was basically he said, I want to be Raymond Chandler. That's it. And then of course he discovered, well, there already is a Raymond Chandler.
Right.
So
And
then
so
his thing was,
yes.
What if I had a rock band behind me, but tried to do this same sort of thing of have like deadpan urban reportage that was sleazy, deadpan, poetic, all these things that like the plots in Raymond Chandler, you know, he could barely get Marlowe to walk down the stairs. Like he couldn't plot anything, but it doesn't matter.
Right.
Because you like just remember him driving, talking to himself, going, this used to be an orchard, now it's a donut diner. What happened, right? And those are great moments, right?
Right.
So Lou Reed was just like, what if I take the germ, like the best thing out of this, that Hans, and had a beat behind it?
Yeah.
So that was kind of interesting. So then for me in the 90s, I wanted to be Lou Reed, and I thought, well, there are certain things I got out of that, and other things I wanted to talk about that he didn't, and take it in a different way. So basically, like I guess this kind of might date me, but I always thought the way people like Lou Reed and Alice Cooper and Mark Bolan from T-Rex were able to mix lines that you hadn't heard before with humor and with rhythm and meter and make it fresh. I always thought that was kind of inspiring. And same thing, like when it comes to music, one really big thing that had an impact on me was like most writers, I was a hermit. I'd prefer to never go outside again for the rest of my life. And then in my first book, the poems looked nice on the page. They had couplets and stanzas. And then to sell the book, I had to go to readings. And that process of hearing the poems reminded me, oh, the difference between poetry and a newspaper article is it's supposed to be processed by the ear. And like Hopkins and Auden, they all agreed that before you tell me the meaning of life, the number one job of a poem is to be pleasing to the ear.
Yeah.
So now my poems, I feel they're much more closer to the song end of the spectrum, where for me, the poems having like a musical. So I think when I'm writing, I might not be listening to music very much, but it seems like the poems, to please me, end up having a kind of musical logic to them.
Right.
Where, like, you know, when someone plays a flat note of the piano, like you can't hide it, right? And it really is kind of pleasing to be able to have like this structure to it that that music does have. So music is definitely a fun part of it.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, so read Postcard from Babylon for us.
Actually, I want to do something else too.
Okay.
This is a poem. This is funny. This is a poem I wrote on the day René Girard died.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, And it's funny, people who like Rene Girard tend to go overboard with him for good reason, because his project does have a lot of explanatory power, right?
Right.
So anyhow, this is from the previous book called Sinner's Dance.
Okay.
And this is called A Lesson in Civics. And again, I just like how poetry boils off all the fat of everything.
Right.
Like Rene Girard isn't a lot of fun to read. Like his prose style isn't really burning up the charts.
No.
But this is like the boiled down version of it. So this is called A Lesson in Civics. Every city needs a Frankenstein. Civilization demands a scapegoat. Community unity needs an other, an outsider who can unite us in a ritual act of purgation. The tribe would fall apart without it. We need someone besides ourselves to blame, someone to nail to a tree, to bear our sorrows, to cleanse us anew when we drive him out with pitchforks and torches. Last month, we scapegoated a whole family of Frankensteins. They talked funny, they dressed weird. Their differences reminded us of what we have in common, the ties that bind our tribe together. Our lawns were vandalized, our pets disappeared, our property values were threatened. We covered them in tar and feathers. We marched them into a boxcar heading down to Galveston, Texas. We danced and sang all night. Our tight-knit community once again had survived. Our city is a good city with a venerable history. We don't know what form the next scapegoat will take, but we know every city needs a Frankenstein.
I really love that. I love the line, their differences reminded us of what we have in common, the ties that bind our tribe together. That's so good.
Yeah, and that's very true. Like, I wish the human race had something better to go on, right?
Yes. Yeah, absolutely.
But so far, finger pointing works better than. Okay, so this is page 21 of the new book. It's called Postcard from Babylon. Thanks to stupidity and fear's lonely duet, we can't have nice things. Movie butter isn't real butter these days. Everything's plastered with warning labels, and even my dreams are copyrighted by Disney. You can't get within 100 feet of Noah's Ark anymore because of all the tourists hacking off souvenirs for their walls. Got some nice shots with the telephoto lens, but it wasn't the same. We paved more ground to alleviate congestion, but it didn't work. Now we just have more time to fume under glass and miss the fireweed, the lilacs, the bees. All those hardworking pollinators sacrificed to the god of progress. Ever think maybe they just invented paradise so they could sell all those no trespassing signs? The truth was on no screen nowhere. The truth was a spy behind enemy lines. The truth was as welcome as a leper as we counted up our assets, parceled our resentments into tiny Fabergé boxes.
Wow. Man. So good, my friend. You definitely have a gift.
Okay, now I insist one more. This is called Slow Dazzle.
Okay, where's this? What's this from?
It's from Permanent Smoke, which will be released in 2022, 2023, something like that.
Oh my gosh, this is awesome. You heard it here first,
yeah.
Boys and girls.
Slow Dazzle. Illusions hangover, puddling and pooling in the pock-marked pavement. Familiar ideologies with their wheels long gone. The NSA satellite that stalks me like a bizarro guardian angel. The quantum spooky action of Walmarts at midnight. The terror of thorns and how you never know if a mantis is smiling or not. The best part of life is it's a mystery, so you can tell the experts to save it for the background performers and NPCs haunting the craft services table. We're gravity's toys, baffled by the slow Dazzle. Instead of getting in on the ground floor of crypto, I fell in love with a cloud and the way silent film stars wave their hands like hammy wizards. Or was it Forex trading? My cousin talked so fast, it was hard to keep it all straight. He sure wanted me to hit the like button. Hope he cashed out before the bubble burst. I saw a bubble once myself. A water spider rode it like a wave. The world held its breath, and everything was madly in love with everything.
Oh man, so good. Really, really good. You know what? What I would love. I don't know if you're doing anything or planning something like this, but it would be so wonderful if you're like if your poetry books are available, like audiobook, and I could just basically have recordings of you reading all your poems. I would love that.
Yeah, I think that's a pretty good idea. I better start trying to figure that out.
Yeah, that'd be good to do. If I can help you with that, let me know.
Okay, cool.
That's a good idea. Thank you so much, Darrell. I love you, man. I love talking to you. The hour just flew by. Love your gift for language and communication and just putting really interesting ideas in my head.
Well, you're very kind. This is great. Thanks. What can I say? You know, it's awesome.
Yeah. Well, let's do it again sometime.
Sure, great.
All right, everybody. If you're listening, please. Again, I don't want to be too salesy here, but it's very difficult as a poet to make a living. If you like any of these poems, I recommend any or all of Darrell's books, and definitely follow him. He is on social media. I think he might even eventually get an Instagram account. We were maybe thinking about that, but he's on Twitter. He's on. By the way, I want to say your Twitter feed is awesome. I mean, seriously, the kind of stuff you post, I think I like everything you do. And retweet. It's really good. But Darrell, thank you so much, man. Thanks for an opportunity to have this conversation.
Thank you very much.
All right, take care.
Take care.